Well, welcome once again to Sebastian and Sierp. We are here with Dan Wu. Dan is the owner and operator of Atomic Ramen, a restaurant here in Lexington, Kentucky. And Dan, how long have you been doing that now?
Over a year and a half.
Year and a half.
Yeah, pushing 2 years.
So I thought we'd start off talking with about the restaurant, because when a mutual friend of ours, Fausto, first told me about you, he said, "Hey man, you got to go check out this place, Atomic Ramen." And then I came over here and I was like, "Wow, this is really a different place. It's comic book inspired, and then the food is quite a bit different than what you might." So please tell us a little bit about how that came about and what you do exactly.
How it came about, honestly, I had not been thinking about opening a restaurant at all, honestly, until this opportunity came along. Well, let's back up a little bit. My food career kind of started about 5 years ago when I got on to MasterChef on Fox. And then I kind of built a career of doing a lot of private dining and small-scale catering type stuff. But like I said, I never thought about doing a restaurant. I had a lot of friends in the restaurant business. I did a podcast for a while, talking to a lot of restaurant professionals in town, and I was just like, man, restaurant stuff is hard. Like, that is not something I want to do. And then this opportunity came along when they were building the summit out here, and they had the idea of doing a food hall. And they wanted very specific types of food in here, and they didn't have anybody for Asian or noodle concept. And so they approached me after a couple of restaurant friends of mine recommended me. So yeah, that's when the idea of Atomic Ramen didn't even occur to me until that moment. And then I started developing it, thinking about it as a brand. And for me, I knew I wanted to do ramen and sort of casual dining, Japanese, Asian influenced, comfort food. And then when I started thinking about the brand and the concept and the aesthetics, I was just tapping into who I am as a person. I'm a big superhero, comic book, sci-fi fantasy geek. So I brought all of that into the brand.
Very cool. So, had you grown up cooking Asian food? I mean, was that a cultural thing for you? Were you?
I certainly grew up eating Chinese food. That's what we ate at home with my parents. And then after college, I moved to San Francisco, lived there for about 4.5 years, and then lived in New York City for about 4 years. And that to me was kind of my culinary education. I've always cooked since I was a kid. But I didn't really get to really appreciate and learn about not just Asian food, but all kinds of food in those two of the best eating cities in America, what I mean? And in some ways, moving back to Lexington was the impetus for me to start cooking more, because if you live in a New York City or San Francisco, you don't have to cook ever, what I mean? There's great food every day of the week. You'll never run out of restaurants in different price ranges. You can eat cheap, you can eat expensive. And then coming back to Lexington was a little bit of a cultural shock in that, I think we plowed through Lexington restaurants in a month, and we were like, now what? And it kind of did inspire me to start cooking more, and I cooked all kinds of stuff. I did a lot of barbecue and French food and continental, just all kinds of stuff. But more and more I started kind of returning to, in a way, my roots, like what I consider comfort food. And it wasn't just Chinese food, it was a lot of different kinds of Asian comfort food.
So when I think of American style comfort food, I think of burgers and fries and pizza. Tell us what would be an Asian comfort food? How would that be different?
You start with rice or noodles. That's kind of your base, and a lot of it, for me, comfort food is unpretentious, very humble, street food, home cuisine. It's not highfalutin. It's simple ingredients. It's some stewed meats. It's some quickly stir-fried vegetables or some pickles. Pickles is huge with a lot of Asian cultures. You always have them on the table with your meals. It's just a great balance. And if you think about a lot of cultural traditions, they come from necessity. They come from scarcity. So pickles are a way that when you have cabbages, during the year, and you want to get through the winter, that's where kimchi comes from. You know what I mean? You ferment this stuff, you put it in jars, you can store it away, and you have food for the entire winter. You know what I mean?
It's interesting because all the Chinese restaurants I've ever been into, I don't think there were some pickles on the table.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. When you think about Chinese food in America, what most people think of is honestly American Chinese food. When you're talking about kung pao chicken and General Tso's and sweet and sour pork, that sort of stuff, it's been very much adapted to an American palate. If you go to a more sort of regionally or Chinese sort of, I hate to use the word authentic, I have all issues with that, but something less Americanized, you will definitely see stuff like that and all kinds of unusual stuff and cold dishes and things like that.
So regarding its Americanization, are we talking about more things deep fried, more things sugar barbecued, like Korean ribs and that kind of thing?
Korean ribs are pretty legit, but when I talk about, and I think Chinese food is the one that falls most into that category. Chinese food, of all the Asian cuisines in America, Chinese food's been around the longest. You go all the way back to the gold rush and to the building of the railroads in the mid-1800s, where you had this population of Chinese immigrants, mostly Chinese men, laborers, and once the gold rush died down and the railroads were completed, they were basically kind of kicked to the curb. Like there weren't jobs available to them, they weren't able to do a lot of the work, and this is back in the mid-1800s in the West, where there were very few women. So what kind of fell to them was what was considered women's work. So laundromats and restaurants. Those were the two things that they were able to do, and so they kind of adapted their cuisine from home to a more Americanized palate. So it was a little fattier, a little sweeter, big chunks of fried food eventually is how it evolved.
See, that's interesting because the image of the Asian American, particularly Chinese, in early film, of course, it was usually a some kind of WASP actor portraying an Asian, right? Yeah. But it was always like laundromats. Yeah. And I remember there was a Lon Chaney film where he played, and so it's interesting because you don't hear that side as much in the Asian culture about, I don't know, how maybe there have been misportrayals or gross misunderstandings.
Yeah, and honestly, a lot of it I wouldn't even say is necessarily misunderstanding, because that kind of puts it mildly. That makes it seem like it's accidental. Mm-hmm. There was a systemic repression, suppression, persecution of the Chinese. I mean, the Chinese were the victims of the only racially specific immigration law we've ever had in this country. There was literally something called the Chinese Exclusion Act, where they literally said, we do not want any more Chinese in this country, or they limited it to whatever number it was. There were a lot of laws dictating if and when they could bring families over. So you don't bring families over, you just have these men, and they were only valued for their labor, you know what I mean? Like during the gold rush, there were a lot of Chinese laborers, but the gold rush was a very exploitative period where you get paid in company scrip, and then you have to buy their hammers and their shovels and their boots. Yeah, it's kind of amazing. So you're kind of an indentured servant, essentially. And then the Chinese were somewhere around 90% of the laborers on the western half of the Trans-Pacific Railroad that connected the whole country, that revolutionized transport in this country. They were 90% of that western workforce. When it came time to do the big famous photograph at Promontory Point where they drove in the last spike, not a single Chinese in that picture, right? Just the foreman, just the whoever else. And once that transport became easy, Americans, white men, could travel more easily to the West for work, and of course all the Chinese were driven away from that work. So then they had nothing, and they had to kind of create from scratch, scrape together this living of Chinese restaurants and laundries and this kind of work. And so what's interesting to me as an Asian American, as a Chinese American man in the 21st century, a lot of the things that I still experience or think about or feel in terms of how we're presented in the media. You think about the Asian man in media, right? We're emasculated, we're nerds, we're desexualized. The only time we're seen as masculine is in kung fu movies, right?
But and even then, you get portrayed by David Carradine.
exactly.
Yeah.
But you think about like Bruce Lee, right? He's kind of the antithesis of a lot of that. He's like a very influential, very masculine, very just brilliant person and character. But does he ever get the girl? Not once. You know what I mean?
Well, he did in the Bruce Lee biopic that they did. But that's different than a fiction.
Exactly. There was even, I think in the 90s, there was a movie called Romeo Must Die that had Aaliyah and Jet Li in it.
Right.
And apparently they shot a scene of them kissing, and then they cut it because it didn't test well or wouldn't test well with audiences.
Wow.
So what kind of bullshit is that? You know what I mean?
90s, dude.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you can absolutely trace all this back to the beginning of when Chinese Americans came to this country. If you think about the image of the Chinese person coming, 150 years ago, they wore these long robes. They were a little shorter in stature than white Americans. They had this long hair pulled back into a pigtail queue. All the markers of like femininity in a way, you know what I mean? They're smaller, they're slighter, they wear these kind of robes, they've got the long hair. So immediately, right off the bat, Americans were like, these people are not. Even though you think about the kind of labor that was required to build the friggin' railroads to mine gold, this is like harsh, heavy physical labor. And they did this work, these little, smaller people, smaller statured people, they did this work. But they were still emasculated and not thought of as men.
Right.
So it's an incredible. When people sometimes talk about like, oh, slavery was hundreds of years ago, get over it. And it's like, if you don't look at history and how history is a through line, it's not like this thing happened and then we started over. It's not like this thing happened and then we just like even the playing field. Oh, everything's cool now. It's like no, all this stuff has built up to the things we experience today in terms of race, in terms of gender politics or sexuality or class, all of that stuff. You know what I mean? It has roots in history. And if you don't know your history and you're just looking at today, it's very easy to say like, well, why don't you people just get over yourselves? Why can't you just, bootstrap it and all that kind of stuff? It's like, well, let's read a little bit. Let's read a little bit of the history books.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, history's so important. What's fascinating to me though is how a lot of groups that were in, say, the last 300 years or since the beginning of the founding of America, displaced or put down somehow, it seems like some have a really strong voice and some don't.
Sure.
But if you were to like have a conversation like we're having right now, then there's sort of like, well, no, actually all of these horrible things happened, but you don't hear about a lot of stuff. Sure. What popped into my head when you were talking about the legal, the only law, that was the Japanese when they were put into internment camps during World War II and so, there's an issue of it wasn't something that a law was changed, but a law was just broken by the government, and said, hey, these people are free and living within the country, they've gone through the process, and yet the hatred is so high that we're gonna.
And evidence shows that there was not a single case of sabotage committed by Japanese or Japanese Americans in the United States.
Yeah.
So A, it was groundless. B, we were also fighting the Italians and the Germans. And did we round any of them up? No.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So just like, you can't talk your way around that situation at all. You can't justify it in any rational way.
Do you think it's because the cultures were so different in their?
I think it was absolutely racially based. I think it was absolutely racially based because if you were to say like we're going to round up anyone of German extraction in America,
what's like you can't visibly see that.
Exactly.
That's the issue.
You can't see the difference, so you can't. And also like by then the 1920s and 30s like German and German Americans were like well woven into, and with Italians as well, into the American sort of, not genetics, but you know what I mean, like the family, the pool. So if you were to round up anybody with a German, father, mother, grandparent, you would have been rounding up senators and army captains and anybody else, right? The Japanese Americans by then weren't fully integrated into American society. They were still sort of in their little enclaves and their little sort sort of closed off communities, sometimes not by choice, just because they were excluded and this is where they lived. So it was very easy to round them up. It was very easy to point, aha, you're the enemy. And there were instances, I remember seeing pictures where there were Chinese businesses that had signs in their window that said Chinese. You know what I mean?
Confusion.
Yeah, and it'd just be like, not us. And it's such a,
It's like it's almost a self-labeling or someone else labeling.
Yeah.
I mean, much the same way a Star of David might be put on.
Yeah.
You know, in the pogroms of
Yeah.
Europe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it was such a devastating thing that happened to the Japanese Americans in the United States. So this is an interesting thing. If you were a white man who had a Japanese wife, she could stay with you. But if you were a Japanese man with a white wife, he goes to the internment camp. She can choose.
Wow.
She's not going to get rounded up, but a lot of times the American spouses would go, because they didn't want to break up their families. So you think about that as not just racial politics, but sexual politics.
Right.
If you're a white man, this Japanese woman is your property, and we're not going to mess with your property, and you're fine.
Yeah.
But if you're a Japanese man, well,
I wonder if do you think it's because maybe they felt less threat from the Japanese woman, you know what I mean? Because in the sense
no, I don't think in that sense, no, because if you were a single Japanese woman, you're still going to the camp. It's not like they just rounded, I mean, they rounded up children. They rounded up old people, men, women, and children. There are children, one person that, George Takei, who was on the original Star Trek, he's been a very vocal sort of activist and kind of social media star now. He was a young person or a child during the internment. He's been in a play in the last few years about the internment camps and stuff. It's just like, that's our living legacy, you know what I mean? The people who lived through that.
Yeah, and it's amazing. People, maybe even people coming out of college nowadays, haven't heard that. Yeah. I mean, of course, slavery in America, you get the full picture on that, but
I don't think you do even get the full picture.
But way more than, like, if I went up to someone on the street who was, say, 25, and I said, have you heard about this Japanese internment thing during World War II, or the Chinese building the railroads? I'm not sure that they would say yes, but if they said, have you heard about Lincoln freeing the slaves, or I mean, those are, at least here in America. Now I don't know how it is in the cultures, like in China. I don't know how they feel about, I mean, maybe you could tell us if something you know about.
Well, the interesting thing is, so in America, if you're an East Asian person, if you're Chinese, of Chinese, Japanese, or Korean descent, you will get mixed up with the other all the time. People will look at me and be like, oh, are you Korean or are you Japanese? Especially I'm running a Japanese influenced restaurant, so half the people who don't know my last name think I'm Japanese. So we get confused for each other all the time. If you look at the history, the 20th century history of China, Korea, and Japan, and then Southeast Asia also, we've been at war with each other for decades and decades and decades. If you look at my grandparents' generation, the Chinese hate the Japanese. The Japanese hate the Chinese. The Koreans hate the Japanese. You know what I mean? Like, because they've all had these sort of histories of like brutal warfare between them. And it's interesting now, like as I often think of myself as an Asian American before Chinese in a way, because the connection that I have with a lot of other people are people of Asian descent who live in America. So somebody, one of my best friends in high school, Bill, and I can't remember if he came here either as a baby or he was born here, but his family's Vietnamese. And I have more in common with him than I do somebody who just landed off a plane from Shanghai. You know what I mean? Because we had the same experience growing up. We had that sort of what we call third culture kid, where we're kind of in between that old culture of Vietnam or China and the new culture of America, and we're kind of in between, and we're code switching when we come home and go out into the public. We're different people, you know what I mean?
Social cues.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Like you come home and you take off your shoes and you do all the Asian stuff and you eat your food, and then you go to school and you don't want to talk about your food because everybody thinks your food is weird and stinky, and they make fun of you, so you like try to assimilate, and it's just like two different languages. But like me and Bill, he's Vietnamese, I'm Chinese, we're the same. Because we've had the same experience growing up. We've had that same dichotomy, that same push and pull conflict.
Do you feel like, so tell me some of the things that are highly common among the Asian cultures you mentioned. And I mean, that could extend into like Indonesia and other
Sure.
places too. But, in other words, like as an American who hasn't been exposed to that as much, I mean, I know the difference in the food, largely because we get the food here.
Sure.
But in terms of, well, here's how things are culturally when we go back home, but here's what's different between, say, Chinese, Japanese, or Japanese, Korean, and so on.
Yeah.
So, yeah, please tell us about that.
I feel like commonalities between, and again, you can't put a blanket over the whole continent, right? But a lot of the commonalities, a lot of those countries come from a Confucianist background, which emphasize discipline, obedience, sort of unquestioning to your authorities, to your elders, a lot of respect for elders. You could look at it from an American perspective and think too much respect for elders, and that like whatever they say goes. We have to obey them.
That's the way it's portrayed in films.
For sure, and there's truth to it. The idea of valuing the group over the individual. That's a very interesting. If you think about this is a slight tangent. If you think about pretty much any action movie in America, the protagonist has to choose between saving his daughter from dangling off a cliff and saving all of Los Angeles. Right? Always. And in Asia, that would never.
It wouldn't fly, would it?
It's not that wouldn't be a choice. That wouldn't be the dilemma in the story. They wouldn't center it around that, because I think the American ethos has always been individualism.
Yeah, so the mythology was built more on the group due to Confucianism.
Yeah,
but didn't at some point Buddhism come in and then started to coexist? Or
sure, yeah, and a lot of that coexisted, but even those things, it had a lot of the same threads. It was never about individualism. It was never about independence. So it's been interesting. So it's a little bit of a clash when you come here, when you think about the whole idea of the model minority myth, right? That kind of sprung up in the 80s and really persists to this day. That basically said like, oh, Asians, they're so hardworking and they're studious and they listen to their parents and they don't get into trouble. Like some of that is based on the idea of that rigidity of like conformity, right? Like we have to conform and put your head down and work. Put your head down, work, get a 1600 on the SAT, get into Yale, get into engineering school, become a lawyer, all those kind of things. The parenting and the societies, they don't value as much creativity, individualism, the way that American culture does. So that's also sort of a clash, but in a weird way, those kind of stereotypes and ideas came to, if you want to call it benefit the image of the Asian or the Asian American. And what they did with it as a cultural idea of this model minority is they used it to pit us against other minorities, against other people of color. And a lot of us bought into it. So the idea of like, oh, okay, Asians are a minority, black people are a minority, so they're the same. But look, Asians are doing great. They're getting high SAT scores, they're achieving, they're going to schools and doing all this. Meanwhile, these other people can't seem to get ahead, can't seem to move forward. So it must be that these people are hardworking and capable, and these people are lazy and they don't want to put in the work, right? So they create this false equivalency, even though the history of Asian Americans in America and the history of black folks in America, vastly different histories, vastly different laws that pertain to them, and you can't compare the two. But it's a very easy comparison to make, because like, oh, you're different and you're different, so you're the same, you're both minorities, right? And then this one can achieve and that one can't, so what's the difference, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
it all kind of gets bashed.
Yeah, and a lot of people bought into that. My dad bought into that. It's an interesting, there's a weird, interesting thing of, for first-generation immigrants who are racist.
Oh,
It's
wow.
kind of amazing, and you'll see it even with, let's say, like Latinx immigrants who have been here like one generation maybe, and then they'll talk shit about recent immigrants coming in, even though you could be a Mexican American and saying like, well, I worked hard and I got here legally and I did all this, and look at these lazy bums, and you're just like, for me, it's like such a cognitive dissonance of like, whoa, are you not seeing any of this? And so it's again. There's a quote, I think it's Audre Lorde, that said, you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. And that's what that is I think power comes from being able to pit the people underneath you against each other so that they never see the structure, so that they never see that it's the structure that's corrupt and messed up, and they just blame each other. You know what I mean? Like, you think about the LA riots, the tension between the Korean Americans and the African Americans, when that happened. You heard a lot of story about that. Was the story about that? Was that the crux of it? Was it their conflict? No, they're both living under the same system that pits them against each other. So it's crazy.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, having, been an adult during that time, I mean, I can remember clearly a lot of media influence fueling that way past the lifespan it should have had, in my opinion. But you're right, I think the focus was redirected or misplaced or whatever word, but it was definitely not the true picture.
Divide and conquer.
What you were saying a second ago to me is, and it's kind of at the heart of what we're trying to get at a lot with the podcast, is figuring out or looking at how the other is portrayed. And this plays out with a lot of the stuff that we originally got into this for, like with Jordan Peterson. I don't know if you're familiar with him, and a few other podcasters out there who are looking into deeper politico and philosophy and religion and cultural things. But like with your thing about the first generation immigrants, it seems like there is this sense of the other that sort of underlies all racism or batching out of these people. I mean, do you get that sense?
I think for a dominant culture, and this is kind of sad, I don't know if this is human nature or political nature or what, there will always be a need for the other. There will always be a need to rally against somebody else. There will always need to be an enemy, right? You go back in history, there was a time when the Irish weren't considered white.
Right.
When the
like Mongols.
Yeah, when the early
Mongols.
when the early immigrants were like the English. And you think about like the difference between the English and the Irish. You're like realistically, but that was enough of a difference. It boggles my mind as somebody who's non-religious to think about like Catholics and Protestants and their centuries-long conflict, or Shiites and Sunnis.
How many people have died over this
Yeah,
thing?
it just blows my mind. It's like, it's like small, tiny differences. You're essentially the same religion, but over this, we're gonna fight.
And fighting over the same God a lot of times.
Yeah,
That's what's really
very often.
bizarre.
And so, you had the Irish, and then the Italians weren't considered real Americans or white people, and then Mediterraneans or Eastern Europeans. So, and then it's shifted. And then it was the Chinese, and then it was the Japanese, and now it's people from Central and South America and Mexico, and people from the Middle East and Muslims and all this stuff. So there will always be the other, and I don't know if that's a sad fact of human nature in a way. I mean, I think tribalism is so core to people. Unfortunately, it's the same reason that a Wildcats fan hates a Cardinal. What I mean, hates Louisville, or UK and Duke, or the Mets and the Yankees.
Oh yeah, I could say I'm similar with Dan because we've been into comic books for decades.
Exactly.
We're Star Wars fans. This guy's a Star Trek fan, so he's not one of them.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly. You're a uniter, not a divider. That's good. But
Well, there's good to be found in both. I mean,
Yeah.
I've also heard, that there's some evolutionary aspect to it in terms of being wary of outside groups due to disease, or things like that.
something deeper even than the psychology of it in terms of.
I think that.
I think I honestly think you could take just about any two people from anywhere in the political spectrum, sit down over a cup of coffee or a plate of food, and have like a reasonable discussion. Now, you're not necessarily going to walk away agreeing with each other, but at least you can see from the other person's perspective, and that's important. When you have, like you said, hundreds of people, like a protest and a counter protest, well, you're with your people. You're with the anti-choice group, or you're with the racist group, or the anti-racist group, or whatever. So now we're at war. Now, like, here's our people. We're going to yell at them because they're the enemy, and we hate them, and we can't agree with them.
They're kind of locked into the group thing.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely very troublesome. And honestly, like, there's a lot of talk about like today's political climate, and I don't think it's new. I don't think it's sprung up out of nowhere. I don't think Trump's the cause of any of it. Not any of it, but
It seems like it's always brewing.
it's been brewing, and then now
And sometimes it bubbles a little bit, and other times it simmers down,
absolutely,
depending
absolutely.
on
And
whatever's happening.
it's just gotten louder. It's just gotten louder is what it is, and it's very difficult, especially with social media. We kind of curate ourselves into a bubble of like just people who agree with us. I realize that when I post something political, by and large, most of my Facebook friends agree with me. There aren't people that severely disagree with me anymore. So like, which is okay with me because I kind of don't have the mental energy to like argue with somebody so far off where I am.
It's called midlife, Dan.
Yeah, is that what it is? Is that what it is? Yeah.
You do.
No, it's seriously though, like you run out of bandwidth and you're like, do I have time for this
Believe me,
today?
I understand.
Like I often have to talk my fiance Lauren down from like getting into Facebook arguments because like she's like, oh my. I was like, okay, you have time for this because it's not just going to be one comment. You know that, right? You're going to be on this thing all day now, going back and forth with this person who probably will not change their mind, especially because the worst arguments on Facebook are two people who don't know each other, like the mutual friend of the original poster, and they get into it, and you have no common ground. So of course you're like, well, you're a fucking idiot because you're thinking this way and you're absolutely wrong, and then you get into this thing and you can't talk rationally. Whereas if you make a post and I'm your friend, I could be like, you know what, Chip? I don't know about that. Like, I think, have you thought about it this way? Because I'm not going to call you a fucking asshole because you're my friend, right? And we're going to have a civil, or it's very hard to be in a sit-down, across-the-table conversation and have that kind of like Facebook or social media attitude. Yeah, in the same way that like you're yelling at people and flicking them off in your car. But if you were on the sidewalk and somebody bumped you, you wouldn't be like you wouldn't start a fight. You'd be like, oh, excuse me.
Yeah, like there's a buffer there. And I think it's well known that people will say plenty on social media that they wouldn't say to your face. But I think what just occurred to me is that, a lot of times when you do have a conversation like that, or more than a conversation, an argument, even in the presence of solid facts, a lot of times people will just say, well, so what? I'm still right.
No one ever wants to admit ignorance.
People.
Right. Like people are saying the Earth is flat, or something like that, or there wasn't a moon landing or something, and even with all this, like loads and loads of evidence to the contrary, it's just like somewhere along the line, and I think it goes to this other thing that we were talking about earlier too, which is I get something in my head and it's stuck. And now I build all of this stuff around it to support it and to not let go of it. And then it becomes gospel. And anybody that says anything against gospel is now my enemy.
Heretic.
Yeah, heretic. And it doesn't matter if it's illogical or not scientific or whatever, because it's my thing.
I read years ago, somebody said, everybody's entitled to their own opinion. You're not entitled to your own facts. And it's true. And the other part of it that's gotten, I think, worse and worse in terms of just polarized politics is that if we're on opposing parties, right? If I'm a Democrat, you're a Republican, and you say French fries are good, and I'm like, well, that Republican is obviously wrong. French fries are terrible, right? Even though I may like French fries, in the way that Republicans were fine with Romney Care and hated Obamacare, even though they were on a similar model.
Sure,
right?
sure, yeah.
So it's nuts to me from somebody who is a fairly rational, sort of empirical thinker kind of person, I don't mind being proven wrong. One of the things that I've been very proud of myself for in the last probably 5-7 years, as a way of my own maturity, is I don't have to be right anymore. I don't want to spend time proving that I'm right to somebody. It doesn't matter. It's amazing. It's freeing.
Yeah.
Because we can have a debate, and if you walk away thinking the earth is flat, good for you. Have fun, go walk off the edge. It's not my problem. I probably can't convince you, so I won't. And I don't have to have the last word on this conversation. I don't have to walk away from this table thinking like I did it. Whatever, I don't have time.
It's maturity. You don't have anything to prove.
Yeah, so it's just gotten so hard, and that's why kind of I don't want to have conversations with people who are going to create their own facts. I can't do it. You're not operating on the same premise. If we can't agree that 2 and 2 equals 4, we can't talk about math at all. I would rather talk to somebody else who I'm closer to and parse out the nuances of like, wait, why do you think this though? Don't you think this is problematic? Or how do you feel about this? Or have you thought about it this way? Oh, okay. And I like to have my mind changed. I think human nature, it's hard to get called out. If somebody says, hey, that thing you did the other day to that lady, that was uncomfortable and a little bit creepy. And my first reaction, a lot of times, naturally, would be like, wait, I wasn't trying to be creepy. I was trying to be nice. I was doing this thing. I don't mean any disrespect. I'm a feminist. Blah, blah, blah. You get defensive, right? And then to be able to stop and think for a second and be like, oh, shit, yeah, okay. Me yelling at her out the window, I didn't mean anything by it. But as a woman, she gets that 14 times a day. And half the time, it's creepy as fuck. And half the time, she doesn't know if she needs to clutch her purse or get her mace out or if her life's in danger. And I'm just trying to be friendly or goofy or silly or complimentary or whatever, but I'm adding to the noise and to the drama and the trauma of this person's life. So I'm wrong in that respect. It doesn't matter what my intent was. I'm going to back that shit up. I'm going to check myself. I'm going to think, okay, next time I'm not going to do that anymore. You know what I mean? And it's not an easy place to get to, you know?
It's very easy to say like.
I think a lot of times you don't realize, just because of how all of us grew up culturally. It might have been a little different culturally for you, but there's still all of these things that are slightly off kilter regarding misogyny or whatever it is. And then if it's brought to light for you, that's great. If you want to change it or realize the impact and then change behavior, that's even better.
Yeah.
But I think it's super difficult for people to do.
I mean, you look at Joe Biden. He's doing this stuff. A lot of people acknowledge that what he did not rise to the level of assault or sexual harassment even. That it's just like it made people uncomfortable. It was a little weird and a little inappropriate, right? He goes out, puts out a non-apology, and then keeps doing it. Like literally he gets called out for it, and like less than a month later, he leans into like a 10-year-old little girl, right? And he says like, you must be as bright as you are good looking. And then puts his hand on her shoulders. I'm like, you obviously don't think you're doing anything wrong. You don't care what people's reactions are to you. You're not learning from it. I will give him leeway. I will give anybody leeway if it's the first time they've been called out and you do not realize it. And I will give them some time to think about it.
I will say that I also feel like there's something of a positive aspect of people acting. Because if somebody's a creep, I want to know if they're a creep. I don't want someone to put on a mask of civility and then behind closed doors become.
Well, I think that was the whole logic behind Megan's Law when it was created initially. Was like, if we release these guys that have done horrible things to kids, some women, but mostly guys, well, if they move into a neighborhood, it's like the people should know about it. Yeah. And there's advocacy against that. Yeah. And I'm like, I'd rather stay for it because...
Yeah. Honestly, being married now, I want my wife to be aware. I want her to be on the defense as much as possible. I worry about it. I worry about serious problems. And I'd rather her take a defensive position to something that's not a serious problem. And, just being in that mindset.
I'll say this though. Your point made me think about this, and this is the thing that's been really frustrating coming out of the Me Too movement, is that so much of the conversation is about women being aware, women speaking up, women reporting it, women being defensive, women supporting each other. Nobody says a goddamn thing about men changing their behavior. And this problem will not solve itself unless men change their behavior. That conversation is not being had at all. And it blows my mind. It blows my mind that it's not happening. I think about like Louis C.K. as a really good example. I loved Louis C.K.'s show. I loved his comedy, right?
Sure.
Up until all this stuff came out. And I even struggled for a moment myself, because I remember when like stuff was going down with like Roger Ailes and people like, people I didn't like, and I was just like, well, fuck them, good riddance. And then when it came to somebody I did like, it took me a little longer because I was wanting to continue to like them. And I was doing gymnastics in my head to think like, oh, maybe it wasn't that bad, or can I still support the art if I don't support the person?
It was the Al Franken thing.
Yeah, and Al Franken, exactly. And that was a big one for me as well. And I had to get to a place to think like, no, if you have principles and you believe certain things and you believe women shouldn't be harassed, then you have to draw a line. It doesn't matter if it's your favorite person or not, you know what I mean? So for me, his is a really great sort of anti-example. So he got called out for all this stuff, all this shit came down, his shows got canceled. He had actually directed a movie that never got released.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, like a feature length that was supposed to be released like a few months later, and it got completely it's in the trash somewhere. So
the one that Spacey was in, and they had to reshoot.
Yeah, Christopher Plummer.
Yeah.
But so he kind of went into the wilderness for a little while, right? He comes back out a couple months later, not changed at all. He's trying to do these little like stand-up, little pop-ups, and he basically doubles down on half this stuff. He continues saying this stuff, and he goes to that old trope of like comedians, like, can't you take a joke? Like, I should be allowed to joke about anything, can't you take a joke? And he starts saying all the shit. You don't get to do that. You don't get to just like, I'm going to hide until it blows over, and then I'm going to pop back up being the same asshole that I was and continue with my career. You don't get to do that.
Like rely on people's short memories.
Yeah. So I approach it on two different levels, and I kind of approach this the way I live my life and the way I run my business. I think you can be a good person with values and be a good, strong brand, because I think people think about those things now the way they didn't used to as much. You think about, what kind of company do I want to support? Is it just that I like eating their food, or do I like what they stand for? So from a completely crass point of view, brand building point of view, if Louis C.K. had come back out, was contrite, made an actual apology, and then followed up with actions, like, I'm going to donate my next year's salary to rape crisis centers or whatever it is, this kind of counseling. America loves to lift up celebrities. We love to knock them down. But you know what we love more than those two things? We love a fucking comeback, don't we?
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Underdog story.
Yeah, underdog story of like a real sort of comeback story. We love it, and we would support it. So he had the opportunity that if he genuinely took some time, went to therapy, talked to some people, looked inside himself, and said, like, this behavior is toxic, and it's gross, and it's wrong, and I can't be doing this anymore, and to come back out and say those things, and then go on a speaking tour to high school boys and say, like, this is the way I was brought up, and this is the way I looked at women, and it's wrong, and this is the way we should be doing it. Take his platform, take his notoriety. If he called up CNN and say, hey, I want to do an interview with you guys, right? They'd book him like that.
Sure.
He has that platform to undo the damage that he's done by using his notoriety to call for change, if he genuinely believed that, right? And to talk to young men and boys about this kind of stuff, who look up to him, who enjoy him, who respect him, right? If somebody like that went up on a national platform and said, like, hey, what I did was wrong, it's repulsive, this is the way I thought about women, this is wrong, you can't be doing that, and I'm going to change and move on, I think it would be inspiring. I think he would get his career back. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and probably get it back in like an honest, good way, not just to,
Yes.
Go for popping back up out of the hole after a while thing. Like you
But
said.
how often have we seen that happen? Like somewhere around 0, I feel like. You know what I mean? Everybody
Not
just
thinking
goes,
anything.
everybody just goes into hiding, hoping it'll blow over. And the good thing, hopefully, of this crest of the Me Too movement is this shit is not going to blow over. Like, we will remember you. We will have a long memory about this stuff. You can't just pop back up and be like, is everything cool now? No. You're still that asshole that did the thing. So get back in your hole and think about what you did.
We're here with Dan Wu. We're going to take just a minute to hear this word from our sponsors.
Now in its 5th season, the Athens West Theater Company begins the Season of Hope. Brighton Beach Memoirs, the classic by Neil Simon, will run from October 4th through the 20th. Please visit Athens West on Facebook or at their website at athenswest.net or call 859-425-2550. There's something about my house that holds the past. My body holds spirit in similar stead. Memorizes in cells with potential flame, ghosts of the worlds by flesh and bone fed. The walls of this room are my heart's strength, the sink my blood that flows with fire. The bedroom holds my resting bones, the brick my flesh and fair attire. I was a boy who lost his way on the winding wood of spirits slain. No memory, no fair words portray on the glade where kings and princes reign. A castle under the silver moon hovering by the sea that pounds below the thundering sky to infinity. A maiden in the castle keep, her hero in the moat. A girl who for her lover weeps, armed guards in every boat. Find these poems and many more at lulu.com, L-U-L-U, lulu.com, under Charles Sebastian. Charles Sebastian, Seasons of the Centaur. Available at lulu.com. At Kyojute-ryu Kempo, we believe that everyone has the right to defend themselves and their loved ones. Violence can visit us despite age, race, or gender. Call us at Kyojute-ryu Kempo or check us out at kyojuteryu.org. kyojuteryu.org.
Hello, I'm Chip Sebastian. I am the co-host of Sebastian and Sierp. If you've been liking the shows, please click like down below. And if you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, jump on over to YouTube, click subscribe, and you will get the most recent episodes of our show where we're interviewing all kinds of great and interesting people. So we're looking forward to a lot more shows. Stay tuned. It's rolling. Just begun. That is the hat for Atomic Ramen. We are back. We are here with Dan Wu at his restaurant in Lexington, Kentucky at the Summit. We've been in conversation with Dan about a lot of things thus far, and I'd love to stay where we were because it's good stuff. I want to still talk about food because I love food.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's good stuff. So we're talking about Louis C.K. and others like it. You know, something that was occurring to me was I think that you have some people that may or may not be able to do the speaking tour and revive their career, though. Like, for instance, Spacey. Maybe. But I saw a little video clip of when he was finally called into the court. I don't know if you all saw that, but you know, because basically he was in hiding all this time. During the time he was in hiding, he makes a little home video where he's talking really arrogantly, cooking, and talking about what he did and how it wasn't a big deal and all this kind of stuff. And then he put it on Facebook, which blew my mind because I'm like, why would you do that? And then he had to show up at court. When he's there, the whole time, this shot's on him, and he's just kind of acting, to me, what appeared to be really smug the whole time the process was going on. So if he at this time said, well, you know, I've had a huge change of heart, I want to go out on a tour, or maybe Weinstein, for instance, if they went on a tour, or somebody like that. All right. I don't know if women would show up about that, unless it was to, with hammers or something. But so it seems like there are these certain grades of forgiveness or comeback ability, and it could be that there were so many different infractions over a long period.
Well, even when they do come back with some kind of apology, you almost get this. You feel like it's disingenuous. Somehow.
Yeah, well, it's their publicist saying like, you got to get out in front of this, you got to put out this statement or whatever, and it's a tactical move. It's not a genuine contrition. It's not genuine, reflection. That's interesting. You bring up an interesting point about sort of, in some ways, the gradations of, if you think about like what Me Too encompasses, it goes all the way from rape and sexual assault to inappropriate behavior and rape jokes. You know what I mean? And those are not the same thing. And I don't think the punishment, either legally or socially, should be the same for a Weinstein versus an Al Franken, right? Not just politically, but one guy was a serial rapist. The other guy made some stupid, inappropriate, crass jokes or behavior, grabbing. You know what I mean? A big part of it too is like, I think an isolated incident is different than a pattern of behavior. All right. Louis C.K. was a pattern of behavior where he used his power and position to put people into situations that they couldn't get out of. Right? If you and I were hanging out and I did something weird or uncomfortable to you, you have the power to walk off because we're equals. I don't have power over you. I'm not your teacher. I'm not your boss. I'm not somebody who could get you a job. I'm not a casting agent. You're not an actor, right? If I did something inappropriate, you'd be like, fuck, man, I'm out of here, right? But if you're my employee, right, like I'm a boss, I have employees, there are things that I could do to employees that they can't do anything about if they want to keep this job. You think about all the famous people that have come out with, under the Me Too movement in terms of accusing their bosses and their colleagues and stuff. Now think about all the millions of McDonald's workers and factory workers and minimum wage workers that are harassed on a daily basis by their managers, by their supervisors, who can't do anything about it because they need that $9 an hour job. You know what I mean? They don't have the platform to be able to come out and speak about it. They're not a famous person, right? They're shit out of luck. Recently there was a thing about McDonald's being sued about their culture of like sexual assault and harassment. And they're, of course, taking that step back and saying like, oh, no, these are franchises. We don't have anything to do with them. Like, are you serious? You have everything to do with them.
Your name on them?
They have to operate. I mean, my parents used to run a Subway sandwich franchise. You have to operate exactly the way they tell you to operate to the letter, or else they yank that thing away from you for breach of contract because they're trying to maintain their brand, right? Of like every McDonald's should be like McDonald's. So in the same way, them shirking this responsibility is complete BS because you're responsible for that kind of behavior too. You know what I mean? They're trying to dodge it. So ultimately, it always comes back to sort of this culture of like, do we permit this kind of behavior? You know what I mean? And the sad thing is, the powers that be that can make these decisions are also the abusers, and they're not going to like monitor them themselves. But going back to the original point, I hope that as the movement and the awareness, not just about sexual issues and gender issues, but also sexuality and LGBTQ issues and racial issues and people being called out for things. I hope that as we move forward, it becomes more nuanced, that we can have a different kind of reaction for an Al Franken than we do for Weinstein, that they have different consequences and punishments. You could argue, did Al Franken deserve to lose his job because of it, or did he have been censured or something else, right? Whereas on the other hand, with like Weinstein, you can't argue that guy needs to be convicted, or indicted for these actual crimes. You know what I mean? I kind of hate the term sexual misconduct because that just sounds like hanky-panky. It sounds super light, like misconduct. Oh, there was a little misconduct. It's like, that's not misconduct. That's like a crime, or that's assault. You know what I mean? So I'm hoping as we go forward, the language becomes more nuanced, our reactions become more nuanced with it. In some ways too, we have to slow down the call-out culture a little bit. Things snowball so fast. If I went on Facebook right now and said, so-and-so is an asshole because he did such and such, you know, all of my fans and all of my supporters will suddenly come out against you, right? Even though they don't necessarily have the proof or the evidence or whatever it is. The Jesse Smollett thing is a great example of that. Like, people came out for it, and I was so pissed at him when stuff came out about what he'd done. It's just like, how much damage have you done to actual victims now? You know what I mean? Because there are a lot of people who are always like, oh, you know, people are always falsely accusing people, even though the evidence is like the false accusations of things like rape is like minuscule. You know, the things that have been proven to be false. So this high-profile guy coming out and doing it, it solidifies sort of the people that are thinking the other way. It solidifies people's, you know, theories. See, this guy's making it up, so lots of people must be making up these kind of stories.
Right, it's like a crying wolf scenario.
Yeah, exactly. But I think people react so fast to it anymore. They don't analyze it. They don't look at the story. They don't think about it critically. I remember a few of my friends, when that first story first came out, we were just like, what? Like, wait, a couple of white supremacists who watch Empire? Like, first of all, like, Empire. Right? And then to target this like second tier supporting actor, and then they had like rope in their, like a noose in their bag. It's like, you know what I mean? It's just like a lot of holes in the story. It just sounded nuts. But people didn't look at it critically. They just looked like, oh, this thing happened, now we're for him or we're against him immediately. You take sides. And
it's like the other thing again. It's like we're so chomping at the bit and white knuckling it to be like, you know, who's against me? Who's, you know?
Sure.
The McGaw kid at the pro-life rally or whatever, and they had like 15 seconds or 10-second clip or something of him laughing or making a smug face.
Who was it?
Yeah, the kids from the Catholic school here in Kentucky.
Yeah. There was a Native American, elderly Native American protester who was there, and I think he was either singing or chanting or playing drums. And then there were all these Catholic school kids from northern Kentucky, I think, something like that. Yeah, Covington. They had their MAGA hats on, and the one kid was just standing in front of them, like just this like harassing sort of face. It's like,
I didn't see that.
You didn't see anything?
So
they initially aired like this 10-second clip or whatever, kid standing there in front of the guy. Then later there was probably an hour and a half of film where he approached, the kid was just kind of standing there, and then he approached the kid with a group and instigated some form of confrontation. The kid never said anything to him. Never said anything, just standing there. And of course, you know, after that 10-second clip, everybody blows up, you know, these racist kids from Kentucky, you know, take these kids out and, you know, disembowel them or whatever, and that just wasn't the situation.
Yeah, there was a lot with that reaction too. Like, a lot of people were trying to dox the kid and put the information out, and it's like you kind of have to start drawing a line between like minors and, you know, adults too. So it's just like there's so much.
Yeah, so many shades of it.
Yeah,
even general calls for violence. I mean,
sure.
You know, just the kid standing there with a smug look on his face in front of a Native American guy is not a reason to beat somebody up.
Right.
Well, and it's always been in law that you can be jailed or sentenced for, you know, instigating riots and things leading to violence. But the problem is once again, the grades of that. Like, were you standing on the street corner sounding like a nut saying, you know, down with somebody, you know, rally, or were you, you know, putting a bomb somewhere?
Sure.
I mean, these are, you know, it's kind of like the offenses you were talking about earlier. There's such a wide, like, you know, I was, when you were talking about McDonald's, what sprang to mind regarding home offices dropping their franchises like hotcakes was that Jared issue with Subway. Right? I mean, and you remember as soon as it came out about him with those multiple, I don't know how many, but I mean, it was like, I've never seen anybody be dropped so fast, you know, rightly so. Yeah.
So it's, unfortunately, for most corporations, doing the right thing is not the top of their list. Shareholder value is their bottom line. So for them, it's about like, will this blow over? What's the least we can spend to save the most, ultimately? Because they don't want to, for people to literally spend millions of dollars on Louis C.K.'s movie and then drop it and not release it at all. Now, granted, he wasn't directing the Avengers or anything that huge of a tentpole. It's a little indie comedy. So I think they took that thing to like, okay, there's no way we can salvage this. We can't undo it, so we're just going to shelve it and keep the $12 million or whatever we spent on it. But imagine if that came out about, I don't know, a Joss Whedon, you know what I mean?
Right.
Somebody of that level.
With a $200 million.
Yeah, and what if like
Marvel
Avengers?
movie.
Yeah, what if Avengers Endgame was coming out in 3 months and that came out about the Russo brothers or whatever, right? What do you do there? That's an interesting sort of calculus, right? Like, I feel like for me, like the studios would have just, deflected as much as possible and then put the thing out.
Well, if they did it with a much smaller, lower budget film like, and I'm forgetting the name of it, but the one that Ridley Scott directed with Spacey, and they had already finished that, and I'm not sure if it was on budget or not, but of course once the Spacey stuff came out, they had to reshoot it with Christopher Plummer, and I'm sure that probably cost them a third of the original budget. So apparently, cutting the losses was worth it in that regard.
To add to that, what came out after is they had to reshoot scenes also with Michelle Williams and Mark Wahlberg.
Yeah, and they were pissed about it, weren't they?
Well, no. It wasn't so much that. They paid Michelle Williams scale for her reshoots, and they paid Wahlberg, I don't know, a couple $1 million.
Right, I remember reading that.
It's like, well, you know what I mean? The fact that, and for me, like as a small business owner, I feel like I know what I can get away with, and then I know what's going to help me sleep at night. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And what are the right things to do for my employees, for my customers, for my family, all that kind of stuff. And it doesn't have to conflict. You know what I mean? For me to, pinch that extra penny to make another buck, if I'm going to have to screw somebody else doing it, I shouldn't. And I feel like a lot of smaller business owners, because we're connected, like these, a lot of my employees are younger. I feel kind of paternalistic towards them. A lot of them were high school kids. It was their first job. So it was me kind of molding them into like, not just like, this is how you do the work. It's just like, hey, you got to show up on time. You know what I mean? Like, hey, you can't call in like this, or you got to communicate with me, because they don't know. And I'm looking at it like a parent of trying to be like, hey, listen, this is going to be this way with every job you have. So you got to take this seriously, or you got to deal with this, and giving them extra chances and trying to help them, because I have the direct connection of working with them every day. When you become a big corporation and there are 46 layers between the CEO, and the production assistant, they don't give a shit. You know what I mean? They look at the bottom line, like how much more money or cost can we squeeze out of this project, and can we get away with this, and do we axe this project, or can we get out in front of it, hire a PR team, get them to come out and apologize, put out some posters, and save this thing. You know what I mean? It's about bottom line. And I hope it's changing. I think with social media and with people being aware of things, hopefully you can have that call for change from the grassroots, when people say like, that's not acceptable, and we don't want to deal with this, and we won't come and give you money or support.
It should be, right. It should be a societal reaction, ostracize a business or individual, in my opinion, rather than some form of law being in place. The government gets involved, and it should be done.
See, I think an important thing to look at too, and to sort of tie it in with what we were talking about earlier regarding how Confucianism led to the group being more of the main thing in old China, and then I guess for centuries and centuries, even with the advent of Buddhism. But then when China became truly communist in, 1945, I think it was?
Yeah,
49, okay, yeah, so, I wonder, number one, if that philosophy preceding that sort of led up to the rise of communism in China during that time. But then also, I think it's important to draw a distinction between what we're trying to do today through awareness, where we're not necessarily saying, make the country communist, but, we're saying that all of these different groups exist, and we need to have some kind of playing field that has a good yield for everyone, like some kind of fair yield based on effort, not heritage, right? And so, that's kind of what was rolling through my mind, because it seems like in some of the other talks we've had, there has been this sort of precipitory thing with a lot of cultures when they do get like highly communist or highly groupthink oriented. I mean, are you guys tracking me? Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Because the way Americans tend to see it is either conservative Democrat, individual communist. There's this really these hard lines that go on, and I guess it's because the media can perpetuate it that way, and we have to have some way to say it during conversations.
Yeah. I think what's important is to have the awareness of how much privilege you have. I don't have the privilege of being a white person in America, but I have the privilege of being a cis hetero man in America. That puts me many steps ahead of a lot of people, because I'm straight, because I'm not trans, because I'm a man. There are things where people don't question my authority on because I'm a man, the way that they question my fiance's authority on because she's a woman. You see these funny examples on Twitter where a woman will come out and say something about some kind of scientific fact about a neutron star or whatever, and some jackass would be like, well, actually, that's not true. And then she's like, well, actually, that is true because blah, blah, blah. And he's like, what do you know? And he's like, well, I'm an astrophysicist, so you can kiss my ass. But the idea that, as a man, I don't have my authority and expertise questioned in the way that a woman does. You know what I mean? In the same way that, let's say, if I had a Southern barbecue restaurant, I would have my authority or expertise questioned, and I would be asked for my bona fides, like how long you've been cooking barbecue, blah, blah, blah. Whereas if you did it, knowing nothing else about you, just because you're a white guy, gives you authority. You know what I mean?
So, at what point do you say, this is just life? And at what point do you say, well, we should actually do something about it?
You can always say this is just life,
right?
And I'm never going to say this is just life and I can't change it. The minute you start saying that, the minute you give up to the forces around you. It's the idea that, the saying goes that if you're not fighting for a solution, you're part of the problem. And I believe that deeply because we're not sitting still. Like if I say I will do no harm, I'm just going to sit still and do no harm. You're still part of the problem because we're not sitting still. We're in a boat, and the boat is moving on a river, and it's going to move a particular direction whether we want to or not. And we can either go with it, even though we don't like where it's going. We're heading towards some rapids. I don't know. It's just life. Or we can row against it as much as possible. We can tell other people to row against it. We can throw obstacles in the way and try to prevent it. So I think we can always, if you see something that's wrong, you can always fight against it. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it too goes back to I think there's a personal responsibility issue. And because we are dealt these different things, and there is a certain amount of privilege in this country for certain people, just like in any country, I think. But the other thing too is I think if you go down that slippery slope of victimization, which I think a lot of people do, because being absolved of any responsibility feels great.
I don't think recognizing privilege or recognizing the obstacles that you've had in your life absolves you from that kind of thing.
No, I'm saying I think that there are a lot of people out there that do. I think that there are plenty of people who take that, whatever it is, I'm a Mexican American, I'm an Asian American, they say, man, I'm really going to work hard because,
you have to work twice as hard to get half as hard.
Yeah, that's
the
you know,
reality of it, 'cause
and
you're the short kid behind the fence.
That's what I'm saying is how do you quantify it? You can't quantify
no, you can't quantify it. I mean,
I don't think you need to quantify it. I think it's a question of how do you give people the tools or the opportunities they need to succeed on an even playing field.
But how do you decide what that is and what dimensions to take into accountability?
well, there aren't. That's the problem. There aren't any metrics for it. I mean, you know that it's there.
I have blue eyes. Only 20% of people in the United States have blue eyes. Is that somehow changed my advantages? Am I now?
Yeah. Have you experienced setbacks or discrimination or lost opportunities because of your eye color?
No, but I have had people say, "Oh, gee, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Nazi." You know?
Well, and these are different grades, right? Because I mean, like I've been bald since I was 22, so there are a lot of people that are like, "Oh, Chip's bald."
How does that affect your chances with women? How does your height?
Well, for me, it improved them because
that's what I'm saying.
I look better bald, But a lot of people look at that as like a weird, "Oh, you're bald. Ooh, you're bald," And I've always been like, I don't care, I mean, when I was a kid, I was really overweight, so I was ostracized for that. That's a grade of the same thing, not to the degree of like living as an African American in America, but. So I mean, I think the quantity or the quantification is there. I don't think we know how to do it. It's so there's so many variables.
How many short guys are passed over for dates by women because of their height?
Sure.
I mean, that happens all the time.
Yeah.
I think there's a difference between things that happen in society and socially. There isn't a law. There were never laws on the books that discriminated against short men, or said that they couldn't date or couldn't date women, whatever. There was never a law that said men had to be taller than women in marriage.
No, I think now we're talking about unspoken tacit laws, though.
Yeah,
not things that are on the books or And it's.
I think here's the thing though. If we had never had legislated oppression in this country, we'd be talking about a different ballgame. All of it was just social. But the stuff is that the social leads to the systemic. You know what I mean? It leads to the prejudice against Chinese led to the Chinese Exclusion Act. Racism in this country created miscegenation laws where you could not marry outside of your race. You know what I mean? And those had to be eventually broken down. There's a vast world of difference saying you can't get a date because you're 5'5", and you can't marry the woman you love, or you can't adopt children because of your sexual orientation. You know
Sure.
what I mean?
Well, sure.
Those are huge differences, and it's a question of. I mean, we're not going to solve racism in this country. There's always going to be a dominant culture. There are always going to be oppressed people, unfortunately. What we can do is level the playing fields to where, like how do you, the fact that you're a woman and you don't get taken seriously in a corporate setting is the reason that we have a tiny proportion of female CEOs in this country, right? And then when we don't have female CEOs and females at the gatekeeper positions of these sort of corporations or companies or universities or casting rooms, any of that, you will continue to have a culture of toxic masculinity. You will continue to have a culture of sexual harassment where things aren't being done, when it's the Harvey Weinsteins of the world that get to the top, right? So how do you solve that, right? You just say like, well, we'll judge everyone on their own merits, right? We won't discriminate anymore. Like we'll just judge everybody.
Which is an impossibility.
Which is an impossibility, and B, if you just did that it's like saying. There was another version of the privilege test where they did it with, I think it was either like high school or middle school kids, where they lined up like 50 kids on like a running track, right? All started like that, and they said, okay, if your parents are still married, take a step forward. If you've never been on food stamps, take a step forward. If you're whatever, boom, boom, boom. And then at the end of 20 or 30 questions, you looked at the field, and it was scattered. And then they say, okay, now run to the finish line and see who finishes.
Right.
Right?
So they picked a few.
So the ones with the certain level of privileges, they're already ahead. Now, it doesn't mean somebody in the middle of the pack can't win that race. But as I said, they have to run twice as hard.
Yeah, like the deck stacked against
Yeah,
them.
the deck is stacked against them. So if you're starting with a race like that, and you say, okay, from now on, we're not going to be prejudiced, and we're not going to influence this race at all. Everybody has an equal chance now. You guys just go. We're not going to put any obstacles in your way. Well, look at the field, right? And this is why, like, people have, I have my own issues with the idea of affirmative action, but that was the core and the impetus of something like affirmative action. It's just like to look at the field and take the people who are way back because of circumstances beyond their own control, because of their background and the things that they've put through, and kind of nudge them forward a little bit so that they can have an equal chance. We're not pushing them to the finish line. I don't think anybody wants to advocate for that. I don't think people in these groups want to advocate for that. I don't think a woman who's in the mailroom says, I need to be the CEO right now because I've never been given a shot. It's not that at all. None of us are saying, like, put us to the top of the field, but give us a fighting chance is what we're talking about. And the fighting chance has to happen, in some ways, unfortunately, has to happen through government policies, because if you left it up to the corporations, in the job scenario, they're not going to do that unless there's enough mounting public pressure where they do it. Here's the sad thing: where you see female CEOs or African American CEOs come in is when the previous white guy CEO pumps up something big. If a sexual harassment situation brings down a white male CEO, they immediately replace him with a woman. Yeah, so it's PR. When there's a big like racial, brouhaha, they knock him down, they bring in an African American CEO. So this is the other reality of it too, is when people of color and minorities are brought into these positions of power, they're given a really tough job. They're basically there to save the company or to turn the company around. So not only are they kind of put in there as a PR stunt or a face, now they have a much harder task, and they're going to be judged harshly because, like, well, why couldn't this guy turn this company around? It's like, well, you ended him a short hand. You know what I mean? So even that's built in to the kind of like systemic racism in issues. So,
I mean, do you feel like for those people who may achieve CEO status or whatever the exalted thing is through that system, like for instance, if they were given however you want to quantify that, a 50-yard head start on the race or whatever, I mean, do you feel like to them feels like a hollow victory because they were given this edge based on...
I don't think so. I don't think... For me specifically, like when I think about something like representation in Hollywood, right? The fact that, Crazy Rich Asians was such a big deal because, we hadn't had an all-Asian cast movie in like 25 years, right? So let's take that example. What's stopping that, right? Are there Asian Americans writing great stories? Yes. Are there great Asian American actors out there? Yes. Are there great Asian American directors out there? Yes. But who approves the movies? Who greenlights these movies? The CEOs and the director, board directors of these companies they're the gatekeepers. They're the ones saying this story's going to sell, this story's not going to sell. There's so many terrible movies being made every year, right? And they get greenlit for whatever reason.
Cash cows.
Yeah. Or not even that. Sometimes there does. Sometimes they don't succeed, right? And the fact that if you have a gatekeeper that says nobody's going to come watch a movie with two Asians as the lead, that movie doesn't get made until it does, and then it proves the theorem wrong. And even then, you look at like Wonder Woman, right? It's like, oh, nobody's going to watch a female-fronted superhero movie. They made it and made a colossal amount of money. Have they really? It was a great movie.
Yeah.
That's the other part. And this is, again, going back to the idea of like the female CEO that has to come in and save the reputation of this company. That female director, I think it was Tamara Jenkins, what a heavy lift she has. Her job is not to make a good movie that makes some money for the studio. Her job is to represent her entire gender, and if she fucks it up, she's screwing the whole movement, if you will. If Wonder Woman was a dud, all the studio heads who are male are going to be like, oh, no, I told you it wouldn't work. Not making any more of those. You know, something like Captain Marvel wouldn't maybe have been greenlit. So they have this heavy lift, and that's why people put so much on something like Crazy Rich Asians, which is a fluffy romantic comedy. It's not, you know, Citizen Kane, right? But you know, but it's not, you know, the best movie in the world, but there's so much pressure put on it because it isn't being made.
No, it's. I mean, the film industry. I speak from this from being in film school years ago. You know, movies don't get made. Like, for instance, if you have a script that gets greenlighted, and then you say, okay, well, we need to get 20 million together for this movie. Producers are not going to say, well, you know, we're going to throw in someone because it's PC to do that. Because like you said, they're just like a corporation. They're interested in bottom line and how do we get a return. And so usually they'll do tests. They'll test audiences and say, well, how did these people respond? And you know, there's questionnaire cards there, and did you like this movie? What could we change about it? And then literally they'll go back and change it because they know it's going to be mass distributed, and the distribution usually costs more than the film itself. And so, you know, a lot's riding on that, and I don't know that they'd be ready to step up and say, well, we want to just cast a woman instead of a man, even though we know the man will do this, or vice versa. You know,
this is the whole issue of, if I've never made a movie, if I've never made a superhero movie with a female lead, then I never will, because there's no precedent, there's no track record, and if you're under that mindset, you will never innovate. Period.
I don't know, man. There are a lot of female directors nowadays, and there have been for a long time. I mean, in film school, we had a lot of ladies going
so
through.
The question is, why aren't they getting work?
But they are. There's some wonderful. I mean, Martha Coolidge is one of my favorite directors. She's wonderful. She's been around for 40 years. I mean, do I?
Do you think part of it is maybe female directors don't want to direct so popular?
No. I mean, I just think I think it happens. It's just, I think it's easy to cite examples, you know, and for me, it's more of a who's best for the job thing. Like you mentioned Citizen Kane. You know, if Orson Welles hadn't had Greg Tolan, who was the cinematographer on that, shoot that film, we wouldn't be talking about Citizen Kane today. Because Tolan was as much, if not more of a genius as Welles. So if it had been a situation where he's like, well, you know, we need to hire this person because of X, Y, or Z. You know, like if you just said, well, look, here are 10 candidates, and here are their demo reels. Let's look at each of them. Blind taste test here, you know. We don't care if they're Asian or black or what. We don't care. We're interested in who can frame the shot, who can tell the story.
I think that's
And by the way, I'm not taking sides on it. I'm just posing the question because that's what this show is about.
Yeah.
But let me pose you something even deeper, and I hope it's not too harsh a thing. Let's say that, you know, God forbid, your daughter took ill and she needed a heart transplant. And in the past year, legislation had been made that said all doctors, there has to be an equal playing field. You have to have a certain number of female doctors and so on. And we just have 3 heart surgeons at our hospital. We're not sure if they're the best for the job. We're not sure. But we do have them lined up, so we're covered from that angle of being sort of PC or choosing people based on, you know, qualifications, race, whatever. Would you feel good about that if your daughter had to go in for emergency surgery and have a heart transplant from a person you weren't certain had?
How am I going to get certain that my doctor is the best? How do you know what I mean?
Well, you may not be certain about them being the best or ranking them, but you would be certain about knowing the legislation had been put into place to have them in there as doctors based on that versus their ability with medicine or their ability to perform surgeries.
I think that's a very false dichotomy of these sort of either gender or demographic, whatever, selection, right? Like
But
either based on
if that could happen though in a studio environment,
I don't see. Okay, here's my problem with your premise is that I think you're separating out qualification and identity.
right?
I don't think it's a question of do I want good or do I want woman. That's a ridiculous assumption because there are plenty of good women.
No, and that's not what I was. No, I wasn't teasing it out in that way exactly. I mean, what I'm saying is if you have, I mean, let's flip it, okay? Like, did you ever see the movie White Man's Burden? Do you remember that? Okay, it's an old John Travolta movie, right? But basically, the premise is that everything was flipped. The black culture was the majority, whites were minority. And you can watch that film as a white, or I'll speak for myself, I can watch that as a white person and it felt, wow, this really feels different. So that speaks whatever it speaks about me personally. I don't know what that means, but if I was to flip that and say, okay, well, we have the three doctors and all three of them were African Americans or all three of them were Asians, and it was based purely on merit, right? I wouldn't have any problem with that as a white American, you know what I'm saying? But for me, I would feel weird if they had chosen the doctors based on we need, one of color, one woman, one, WASP.
When you walk up to my counter and order food, are you guaranteed that I have the 7 best employees I can find?
Well, I have no foreknowledge of it. I don't know your hiring processes or anything.
Right.
But
in the same way that without this theoretical legislation of yours, I don't know what the hiring practice is when I bring my daughter to Central Baptist now, or St. Joe, or UK. I don't know. I don't know how they hire. So I get the doctor that I get. Am I going to say, what are your credentials? Where do you rank on the scale of 100 best surgeons in this field? I have no fucking idea, really. So to me, the premise is flawed in the sense that if you came up to my counter right now, right, I can't guarantee you that those are the 7 best employees I can find in the city of Lexington, right? In fact, it's unlikely.
right.
Just statistically, right? Are they going to give you the best service they can give you? Yes. Are they sometimes not going to be the best? Yes. Right? Yeah. And then as a boss, do I want the best employees I can have? Yes. Do I want to mold these people into the best employees I can have? Yes. Do I want to get rid of the lousy employees? Yes. Can I sometimes get rid of the lousy employees right away? No, because I'm short-staffed. You know what I mean?
Sure.
The realities of life and business. So it's the premise to me is flawed because you're saying right now there's no legislation about who I can hire for my business. So you assume that those are the best people I can find and the best people that can give you the best service. Now if we started a legislation where I said half my employees have to be under the age of 20, right? And so you walk up and there's a 19-year-old serving you. Your assumption would be like, oh, that's probably not a great person because he was required to hire people under 20 years old. So that 19-year-old is not going to give me the best service I could get from a 30-year-old.
Yeah, the flip of that though is that if I walked up to your counter and I saw 7 white dudes back there slaving away on stuff, I probably wouldn't even think about it. If I saw African American, Asian American, 7 people of different cultures back there doing it, I probably wouldn't think about it. And half of them were women, I probably wouldn't even think about it. But I would assume, hey, Dan's a pretty smart guy. He would probably hire the people that are at least doing the minimum requirements for the job. Because, like, if somebody doesn't show up, it doesn't matter what color they are or whatever, they're out of here.
Absolutely, that's the thing. I don't think you can separate identity from actual qualifications, and I don't think anybody from the side of people wanting to create more equity in this country are ever saying, I want underqualified people of color or women or LGBT folks in these positions. I'm never saying that.
But I think it has been demonstrated many times, though, that there are people who are hired
Above people who have other qualifications. I'm not talking about race or gender here, just that they're hired based on some PC formula or some thing that the company is trying to create an image, or even an individual business owner is trying to create an image of some kind that is not fully in the interest of competence. Like, the competence has to be there to a certain degree.
When I first started hiring, hiring is always tough for small businesses. It's a pain in the ass. And you throw an ad out on Craigslist, you get what you get. It's a random grab bag of stuff. You know what I mean? It's not great. So I contacted a bunch of my friends in nonprofits who either do job training, job retraining, job placement for people who have either been out of work and in trouble, victims of partner violence, things like that. Just because they're people I trusted, and if somebody says, hey, I vouch for this person, that they move to the top of the stack for me rather than somebody off the street, right? So I had this kid working for me who had gotten into trouble in high school, served a little bit of time or was in duty, had gone through some like training classes and stuff like that, and now was in like a Big Brothers kind of program. And so I talked to the organizers of the Big Brothers themselves, talked to them about potential people, and they're like, yeah, this kid, he's turning his life around, he's doing really great, he's a good listener, he's a good learner, you want to give him a shot? And I was like, let's give him a shot, and that's fine. Was he the best person I could find for that position? Probably not, because he had never had a job, like a real job. But I knew my own ability to be able to train and mold him to that. And there were times where there were things he did that an average person with experience, an average 25-year-old, would not have done. They were just like stupid stuff. And I would call him out and be like, what are you doing, kid? You know what I mean? Like, this is not how you behave. And a lot of that was from inexperience. And there were times where he showed up for work late because his family didn't pay his phone bill, so he didn't get my call about the shift change or something else, and then he shows up late, and then it exacerbates. So, there's the idea, the very solid idea, that it's very expensive to be poor, that you can't plan ahead, that you can't buy the good phone plan that you're paying, week to week, things like that. So
yeah, you're worried about essential needs.
Yeah, exactly. You can't plan ahead. When you can't plan ahead, like your car breaks down and it's going to be $400 to fix your car. You can't afford it. Now you can't get to work. Now you don't have a job. Now you don't have any money to fix your car, right? So it's this like vicious cycle. So now they're trying to get it right from mom, and mom's got this other job, or mom's flaky, or mom's got a problem. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so there are all these sort of issues. And for me, like, in some ways, like, was it a pain in the ass for me to have this kid in my employ? Yeah, like more than average, right? I'm not saying a huge amount, not saying like to the extent where I couldn't deal with that kid anymore, but did I have to put in that extra effort to think about that?
But so your altruism and your good side or your loving side said, well, I'm going to do this, knowing full well it could turn into something, and maybe it did, or maybe it could have happened where he was the best employee you ever had, but you wouldn't know until he got in there and started doing
That's
stuff.
one thing, and here's my thing. I have an ethos of doing well by doing good, and I think the two are entwined. So for me, it wasn't the dichotomy of I'm going to pick this kid up and mold him because I'm a good person and I want to improve his life, versus what's best for the company. My goal was to do both. Because for me, honestly, for a restaurant job like this, I kind of like bringing in people with no experience. That way I can kind of build them from the ground up and say, this is how you do this.
It's bad when they've already got habits going on.
Yeah, exactly. And so to some degree, and then especially young people, I love teaching, but I find it really great to kind of be able to kind of build them up and create these new workers. I would say almost half the people I've ever hired for this job have been high school kids on their first job, like their absolute first job at age 17 or whatever. And by and large, it's worked out really well. So for this kid, for me, it was that dual purpose of like, he's got potential. He was a really steady worker. He listened really, really well, never talked back, never had attitude. The main issues I had with him were getting to work on time. And it would be one of 7 scenarios, like, his car broke down, or his mom couldn't give him a ride because she had to work a double shift, or his sister was unreliable, or he was trying to get on the bus. Or he shows up not completely in uniform because his washing machine is broken, right? And it's like, and I did what I could while balancing being fair to all the other employees, right? I wasn't going to say, he's a special case, I'm going to treat him special with kid gloves, and I'm going to treat the rest of you strictly or by the book. It was never like that. I was trying to balance those two things. So if I gave him a little bit of leeway coming into work 10 minutes late because the bus ran late, then I'm going to give you that leeway as well.
Yeah.
Or neither.
It's like the tides dropping for everybody.
Yeah.
So this kid technically though is underprivileged. So if we look at this through the lens of equity, he should have been treated something like that.
Yeah, there was a part of me that wanted to, but I'm not working with just him in a vacuum. If I were just a big brother and he was my only kid, sure, I'll give him as much support for him to build himself up as I can. Not to lift him over the finish line, not to, but to give him that push, to give him better shoes, to whatever. But I have other employees to think about as well. People at different levels of privilege. I have other high school kids whose parents bought them a car at 16, and a working car, a decent car, whose parents support them in getting to work on time, who can get their clothes clean in time so that they come in on uniform, you know what I mean? So is one kid better than the other intrinsically, ethically, morally, work ethically? No, not necessarily. But one doesn't have that family structure. You know what I mean? One is like, has all these sort of hindrances. So do I treat them quite the same? Not exactly, but do I have to, for the most part, because I'm running a company of 7 employees and not just one, I have to. Because as much as I want to help you out and lift you up, if you're over here without that help and you show up late a couple times and I harp on you but not on him, that doesn't work. That doesn't work for company morale. You're like, why are you treating him this way? Even though there may be good reason for me to help him, because like you have no excuse, right? You have a working car, you have parents who support you, you have a good school schedule, whatever it is, right? But for me, I always tell people, like, I don't care why you're late or why you don't show up. It's, if your car breaks down or your mom is sick or you stayed out too late the night before, to me it doesn't matter what the reason is, you show up to work on time, you know what I mean? Don't give me your excuses about outside of your life. But if the kid says to me, man, I can't, the buses stop running at 9 o'clock, so if I close and I walk out at 9:30, I gotta wait like an hour for a bus or whatever the situation is, like, can you put me on openers? I'll do that, you know what I mean? I'll make those kind of accommodations. Now, if you're flexible and you have a car, I'll put you on openers, closes, whatever you need. And I try to work with my employees to whatever their requirements are. If they have a club after school and they can't work this day, fine. But that's to me, that's the kind of accommodation that I don't necessarily have to get. If I wanted to be, like a McDonald's or a Walmart and just be hard ass and say, look, I need a closer on Tuesday, so I'm going to put you down, even though I know you can't show up or it's a huge burden for you to get to work. I could say, I don't give a shit, it's your job to come to work. The problem with that is knowing full well that it's very likely you will not show up or you will show up late consistently because of those situations. And now I can say, well, you showed up 3 times late and according to the manual, you're gone. To me, that doesn't make any sense, and it also doesn't help me as an employer either. If I can make...
You've already begun their training.
Yeah,
and a lot of things,
it's a huge investment. It's an investment of my time and energy. So if I can make reasonable accommodations to you, the same that I would make for you. Like, I make that accommodation for you not to let you close on Tuesday because the buses run too late or whatever, it takes you an hour and a half to get home. In that if you said, hey, I have debate team on Thursday nights and it runs till like 7, can you not put me on close? I'll do that for you as well. You know what I mean? So it's not that I'm treating you special. So if I'm going to lift you up and give you those kind of accommodations, I will give them to you.
There's some modicum of equanimity that you're trying to display as an executive.
I read one time that when they said handicap accessibility helps everyone and hurts no one. And I think it's brilliant. Like the little automatic door that opens, right, at hospital doors or whatever. doesn't slow the rest of us able-bodied people down at all.
Yeah.
In fact, it helps us. We don't necessarily need to use it. We don't need that ramp. But does it hurt or hinder us? No. And to me, that's the same way. Like if you lift up somebody, go ahead and lift up everybody. It's not.
Yeah, all the boats fly.
Yeah, I hate the dichotomy of the idea that I'm gonna help and lift you up, and that's gonna automatically put you down. I don't think it has to be that way.
And we know that happens all too frequently in businesses,
I
just
don't
based on
think-
personality, or do I like somebody,
Yeah.
or the power differential you talked about earlier. You know, it just depends on how, to what degree that happens, as to whether or not it becomes illegal or problematic. Listen, I wanted to get back because I wanted to make sure we had a little bit of time to talk about Dan Wu, the Culinary Evangelist, because that is the title that I think you've self-dubbed, right? But tell us what that means exactly.
So for me, when I came off of MasterChef in 2014, I wanted to kind of build a brand for myself. Not having a restaurant or a business at the time, it was basically a personal brand that I wanted to cook, I wanted to teach, write about food. And it's in some ways a tongue-in-cheek name because I consider myself an atheist. But I like the idea of evangelizing about food because, as you could probably tell, like if we sit down in front of a meal, I will rant and rave all day long about this food and this comes from here and this is delicious, you gotta try this, and I'm always like proselytizing and trying to convert people to this food. And I strongly believe that food is the absolute bridge to culture. If we don't know anything about Thailand, we know pad thai. You know what I mean? If we don't know anything about Vietnam, we know pho. And so it's our entry point into conversation. And I also believe we talked about this earlier about having one-on-one conversations. I don't think you can make enemies sitting together for a meal. You know what I mean? I absolutely think you'll come closer.
They're too busy.
Yeah.
Everybody loves food.
Everybody loves food, and for me, I want to continue bridging that gap and using food as a way to bridge those differences. And if you are a little scared of this kind of food or these kind of people or whatever, like, if you're like, Muslims are taking over our countries, like, let's go have some Middle Eastern food. Let's go have a Persian meal. You know what I mean? Let's sit down in front of this food and build that understanding. And then you get to talk to the proprietor, the servers, and they come over and
Just a woo.
yeah.
Tough time.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the thing. It's like if I could get everybody who is opposed to immigration from Mexico and Central America to stop eating tacos, I think we'd figure something out real fast. You know what I mean?
I gotta tell you, Dan, I'm not gonna stop eating tacos.
I know, right?
Nothing is
Exactly. Yeah. If you can't stop eating tacos, then you have to stop hating immigrants. That's my campaign.
Just the
poster.
thought's kind of disturbing me now that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah. Imagine how. I kind of want to imagine. I think they made a movie of this like years ago. It wasn't very big. It was called like A Day Without Immigrants, and it was just like immigrants just disappeared off the planet. So imagine not just our workforce in the state or in this country. Imagine like the food scene, right? Atomic Ramen would disappear. Indian Grill would disappear. Whiskey Bear would disappear. One of the owners
Pretty
was
much
French.
everything would disappear.
You know, Frankenboom would disappear. Her parents are from Thailand.
Well, my wife's a German, and we wouldn't have burgers.
Yeah.
And I couldn't.
Yeah.
You're going to be real hard pressed to find like a really good burger. Or
Now you might find the McDonald's breakfast burrito over there.
Right, exactly. But if you want to go find a falafel.
Dan, it's been lively today. It's been great. It's kind of exactly what we're looking for. We're always hoping that these sort of more peripheral things lead into deeper conversations, and I think that's exactly what happened today.
Yeah.
So we want to thank you for being on the show and taking some time, and that's pretty much it. Thank you to our sponsors. Really looking forward to having the episode out and everybody can see it. Remember, Atomic Ramen is right here in the Summit on Nicholasville Road in Man of War in Lexington, Kentucky. So if you're from out of town and you see this podcast, what a great place to go and eat. Don't do the usual stuff, folks. Don't do stuff you can get anywhere. I mean,
The ramen is amazing.
yeah. The food is incredible. The kitchen looks great. It's immaculate.
that it does not look like a McDonald's kitchen. Sorry, McDonald's, but it just doesn't look like that. And the people are really nice. So drop on by, check that out, get your bellies full, and until next time, we look forward to seeing you on Sebastian and Sierp.
At Kyo-Jute-Ru Kempo, we believe that everyone has the right to defend themselves and their loved ones. Violence can visit us despite age, race, or gender. Call us at Kyo-Jute-Ru Kempo or check us out at kyojuteru.org. kyojuteru.org. Hello, I'm Chip Sebastian. I am the co-host of Sebastian and Sierp. If you've been liking the shows, please click like down below. And if you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, jump on over to YouTube, click subscribe, and you will get the most recent episodes of our show where we're interviewing all kinds of great and interesting people. So we're looking forward to a lot more shows. Stay tuned. It's rolling. Just begun.